Take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let me tell you a story.
Olivia couldn't look at me. She sat on the opposite end of the couch, with her hands locked together so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. A few tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't bother wiping them away. It was as if she no longer had the energy. The room was quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet two people share after a long day. This was the kind of silence that presses against your chest, the kind that makes every second feel longer than it should. I stared at the small object resting on the coffee table between us. A pregnancy test. Positive. Even now I remember how strange it looked sitting there. Such a tiny piece of plastic. Yet somehow it had managed to turn my entire world upside down. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. For weeks, I had searched for answers. For weeks, I had convinced myself that if I could just learn the truth, everything would finally make sense. Now the truth was sitting only a few feet away from me, and for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. Olivia lowered her head. A tear landed on her hand. She closed her eyes. For a moment, I almost reached across the table and took her hand. Almost. But too many questions stood between us. Questions I couldn't ignore anymore. Questions that had followed me for weeks. Questions that had stolen sleep from my nights and peace from my mornings. I looked at the pregnancy test again. Then back at Olivia, the woman I loved. The woman I thought I knew better than anyone. And yet, sitting there, I felt like I was staring at a stranger carrying a secret I couldn't begin to understand. Neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, because there was too much. The silence stretched, my chest tightened, and all I could think was this. If Olivia wasn't hiding something life-changing from me, then why did it feel like everything was about to fall apart? Welcome back to Mr. George Stories, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. If you're new to this family, thank you for joining us. Please hit the subscribe button, because it helps us share stories like this on YouTube. Have you ever looked at someone you love and suddenly realized there was a part of their life you knew nothing about? Not because they were a stranger, not because they didn't care about you, but because somewhere along the way, a wall appeared between the two of you. A wall neither of you knew how to talk about. I wish I could tell you I handled everything perfectly. I didn't. The truth is, once doubt enters your mind, it has a way of changing ordinary moments. A delayed text message feels important. A distracted expression starts raising questions. A simple explanation somehow stops feeling complete. And before long, you find yourself searching for answers that may not even exist. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you've watched someone you love become distant and spent weeks pretending not to notice. Maybe you've smiled through dinner conversations while wondering if something was wrong. Maybe you've gone to bed beside someone you care about deeply while feeling farther away from them than ever before. Or maybe you've discovered something that completely changed the way you looked at a relationship. Something that made your stomach drop. Something you couldn't unsee, because that's exactly where I found myself. Holding questions that seemed impossible to answer. Trying to trust the woman I loved while fighting fears I couldn't control. And the hardest part wasn't what I knew. It was what I didn't know. Have you ever convinced yourself something terrible was happening, simply because nobody would tell you the truth? Have you ever watched a relationship start slipping away while pretending everything was fine? If you have, then you'll understand why that pregnancy test shook me far more than I wanted to admit. Because at that point, I wasn't looking at a piece of plastic anymore. I was looking at a mystery that threatened to change everything. The strange thing is that none of this started with an argument. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shocking confession, no warning that my life was about to become consumed by questions. It started on an ordinary Saturday morning, the kind of morning that usually disappears from memory. Sunlight drifted through the kitchen windows. Coffee brewed on the counter. The neighborhood outside was quiet. Olivia was upstairs getting ready for the day while I handled a few chores around the house. Nothing felt unusual, at least not yet. I grabbed the kitchen trash bag, tied it shut, and carried it toward the garage. I was halfway there when something caught my attention. At first I almost ignored it. A small white object sat near the top of the bag, partially wrapped in paper towels. It could have been anything. A receipt, a piece of packaging, some random item headed for the landfill. But something about it made me stop. I leaned closer. Then I froze. My stomach tightened instantly. It was a pregnancy test. For several seconds I simply stared at it. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe there was another explanation. I carefully pulled it free from the paper towels. Then I looked again. 2 lines. Clear as day. Positive. I remember standing there in complete silence. Not moving. Not thinking. Just staring. Because Olivia had never mentioned being pregnant. Not once. No conversations. No hints. Nothing. And suddenly every unusual thing I'd noticed over the past month came rushing back. The phone calls she always seemed to take outside. The moments when she seemed distracted during conversations. The unexpected trips she rarely explained. The tired smiles. The distant expressions. The way she sometimes looked like she was carrying a weight she didn't want anyone else to see. One memory connected to another. Then another. Then another. Questions flooded my mind faster than I could answer them. I wanted a reasonable explanation. I needed one. But standing there with that positive pregnancy test in my hand, fear reached me first. And the moment I saw that test, every strange thing Olivia had done over the last month suddenly felt connected. What makes this story even harder to explain is that the pregnancy test wasn't the biggest mystery. At the time, I thought it was. I thought that little piece of plastic was the answer to everything that had been bothering me. I was wrong, because a few days later, I discovered something that made even less sense. Olivia had been making regular trips to Sacramento. Not once, not twice, several times, always alone. Always with an explanation that sounded reasonable on the surface. Helping a friend, running an errand, taking care of something important. None of those answers were impossible, yet none of them felt complete. The more I paid attention, the more questions I had. What was happening in Sacramento? Why hadn't she told me about it? And why did she seem so emotionally drained every time she returned? But nothing prepared me for what I saw one afternoon. A simple observation that changed the way I looked at everything. Olivia was sitting at a small cafe. Across from her sat a young woman I had never seen before. The woman looked nervous. Not ordinary nervous. The kind of nervous that shows in restless hands and worried glances. She kept looking down, kept rubbing her palms together, kept fighting tears. Meanwhile, Olivia listened carefully, patiently, protectively. Like someone carrying part of another person's burden. I remember watching from a distance, completely confused, because if the pregnancy test had already filled my head with questions, this scene created even more. Who was this woman? Why was Olivia spending time with her? And why did it seem like whatever connected them was serious enough to keep hidden? What I didn't know then was that every answer I had convinced myself was true was about to be proven wrong. And that's when everything stopped making sense. Before I tell you how all of this unfolded, I want to ask you something. What would you have done? Seriously, if you found a positive pregnancy test in your home, and the woman you loved had never told you she was pregnant, what would your first thought be? Would you confront her immediately? Would you wait and hope she explained it herself? Or would you start connecting every strange moment, every unanswered question, and every unusual behavior until your mind convinced you it had already figured out the truth? I want to hear your honest answer. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're there, tell me the first theory that comes to mind. Because when I first found that pregnancy test, I was absolutely convinced I knew what was happening. The problem was, I was looking at the situation through fear instead of facts. If you're enjoying this story so far, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to Mr. George Stories. Those simple actions help YouTube share stories like this with more people, and they truly help the channel grow. Here on Mr. George Stories, we share powerful stories about relationships, family, trust, second chances, and the life lessons that often arrive when we least expect them. And trust me, this story taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Because what started with a pregnancy test would eventually lead me to a secret hidden for nearly 2 decades. A secret that would challenge everything I thought I understood. A secret that would test my trust, my patience, and my relationship with Olivia. Most importantly, it would force me to confront a difficult truth about assumptions. The truth that sometimes the stories we create in our own minds can be far more damaging than reality itself. Back in that living room, neither of us had spoken for what felt like forever. The pregnancy test still sat on the coffee table between us. Olivia finally lifted her head. Her eyes were red. She wiped away another tear and took a shaky breath. Then she looked directly at me. "Robert," she whispered, "I should have told you sooner." At that moment, I thought I already knew what she was about to say. I couldn't have been more wrong. California had a strange way of making people believe they could become someone new. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was the endless movement. Maybe it was the fact that every day seemed filled with people chasing fresh starts. For Robert, California wasn't a place he came to find himself. It was a place where he finally stopped running. At 39 years old, he had spent most of his adult life focused on one thing: work, success, progress, the next promotion, the next raise, the next achievement. When he was younger, that mindset felt normal. He had grown up in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood where responsibility came before everything else. His parents believed in structure. Dinner happened at the same time every evening. Bills were paid early. Vacations were planned months ahead. Nothing was left to chance. As a child, Robert admired that stability. As an adult, he copied it. For years, he followed a simple formula: work hard, stay focused, keep moving forward. The formula worked, at least on paper. His career steadily improved. His income increased. He purchased a comfortable home. His co-workers respected him. People often described him as successful. The funny thing was that nobody ever asked whether he was happy. One Friday evening, Robert sat alone at his dining table eating takeout from a cardboard container. His television played in the background. He wasn't watching it. His phone sat nearby, silent. The house felt larger than usual. Not because it was empty, because it was quiet. Too quiet. Robert looked around the room. Everything was exactly where it belonged. Everything was organized. Everything was under control. Yet something felt missing. He couldn't explain it. The feeling stayed with him long after dinner ended. A few weeks later, one of his co-workers convinced him to attend a local community fundraiser near the coast. Robert almost declined. Social events weren't his favorite thing. Still, after enough encouragement, he agreed. He arrived expecting polite conversations and small talk. Instead, he met Olivia. The first thing he noticed wasn't her appearance. It was her laugh. A genuine laugh. The kind that made other people smile without realizing it. Robert heard it before he saw her. When he finally turned toward the sound, he spotted her standing with a small group of volunteers. She was telling a story. Everyone around her was laughing, including her. Her energy filled the space effortlessly. Robert found himself watching longer than intended. A moment later, Olivia caught him looking. Their eyes met. Robert immediately looked away. A mistake that only made Olivia grin. A few minutes later, she approached him. "You look uncomfortable." Robert blinked. "What?" "You look like somebody forced you to be here." He laughed, despite himself. "Is it that obvious?" "A little." "That's unfortunate." Olivia smiled. "Don't worry. You're not the only one." Robert looked around. "You seem pretty comfortable." "Oh, I'm excellent at pretending." That earned another laugh. The conversation continued, then continued some more. What surprised Robert wasn't how easy it felt. It was how quickly time disappeared. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. By the end of the evening, they were still talking. The volunteers had started cleaning up. Guests were leaving. Neither seemed eager to end the conversation. Eventually, Olivia checked her phone. "Oh, wow. What? It's later than I thought." Robert looked at the time. She was right. Neither moved. For a brief moment, both laughed. The shared hesitation said more than words. Finally, Robert cleared his throat. So, you probably have somewhere to be. Olivia folded her arms. Are you asking if I'm busy tomorrow? Robert laughed. I think I am. Good. Her smile widened. Because I was wondering how long it would take. Their first date happened the following afternoon. Then another one. Then another. The age difference crossed Robert's mind initially. 39 and 28 looked significant on paper. In reality, it rarely mattered. They connected naturally. Conversations flowed. Silences felt comfortable. Neither felt pressured to impress the other. One evening they sat outside a small coffee shop overlooking the ocean. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon. People walked along the waterfront. A musician played nearby. Olivia sipped her drink. Robert watched her for a moment. What? You ask that every time I look at you. Because you're looking at me again. Robert smiled. I was thinking dangerous. He laughed. Very funny. Olivia pointed at him. No, seriously. Every time you get quiet, you're thinking too much. That's possible. What's on your mind? Robert hesitated, then answered honestly. You make everything feel lighter. The joking expression disappeared. Olivia looked genuinely surprised. What does that mean? Robert leaned back. It means I've spent years treating life like a checklist. And somehow, you make ordinary things feel important. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she smiled softly. You know something? What? You make everything feel calmer. The words stayed with him because they were true. Their differences should have made things difficult. Instead, they balanced each other. Robert brought stability. Olivia brought energy. Robert planned. Olivia adapted. Robert analyzed everything. Olivia trusted her instincts. Neither tried to change the other, and because of that, both became better together. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It arrived gradually. One conversation, one date, one shared experience at a time. Until eventually, Robert found himself looking forward to every moment they spent together. Not because life suddenly became perfect, because it finally felt full, and for the first time in years, Robert realized something important. Money could buy comfort. Success could earn respect. Career achievements could fill a resume. But none of those things could create what he felt whenever he was with Olivia. And that was worth more than anything he had spent years chasing. For the first time in a long time, Robert stopped measuring his weeks by work deadlines. He started measuring them by Olivia. Not in an unhealthy way. Not because his life revolved around her, but because she had become the part of his week he looked forward to most. Monday mornings felt easier when he knew Friday evening would eventually arrive. A random Tuesday felt less ordinary when a message from Olivia appeared on his phone. Even errands seemed more enjoyable when she was involved. It wasn't some dramatic movie romance. It was better. It felt real. One Saturday morning, Olivia called him before 8 o'clock. Robert answered with a sleepy voice. Please tell me this is important. It is. What happened? I need coffee. Robert sat up. You woke me up because you need coffee? I didn't say I needed you to make coffee. That's exactly what you implied. Olivia laughed. No. I need coffee, and I need company. That's not much better. Are you coming or not? 20 minutes later, Robert was standing in line beside her at their favorite coffee shop. Olivia looked entirely too happy for someone who had interrupted another person's sleep. You know, Robert said. Normal people sleep in on Saturdays. Normal people miss out on good coffee. You make an interesting argument. I know. That became their routine. Coffee first, conversation second, everything else after. Some mornings they sat inside. Other mornings they carried their drinks outside and wandered through nearby streets, talking about absolutely nothing. Those conversations became some of Robert's favorite memories. Because with Olivia, ordinary topics somehow became entertaining. One morning they spent nearly 30 minutes debating whether cereal should technically count as soup. Neither convinced the other. Both refused to surrender. A few people nearby stared at them as if they had lost their minds. Olivia considered that a victory. You realize we're arguing about something ridiculous. That's because you're wrong. I'm wrong? You heard me. Robert shook his head. You're impossible. Olivia grinned. And yet, here you are. She had a point. As the months passed, their relationship settled into a comfortable rhythm. They explored different parts of the California coast. They discovered hidden restaurants. They visited outdoor markets. Sometimes they planned activities. Sometimes they simply picked a direction and drove. One evening they ended up at the beach shortly before sunset. The shoreline stretched endlessly ahead. Waves rolled toward the sand. Families packed up after spending the day outside. A cool breeze moved through the air. Robert and Olivia walked side by side without speaking, not because they had run out of things to say, because silence felt easy between them. After several minutes, Olivia slipped her hand into his. Robert glanced down. She shrugged. What? Nothing. You looked. I noticed. You make it sound strange. It isn't strange. Good. They continued walking. A few moments later, Olivia smiled. You know what I like about you? Robert sighed dramatically. This should be interesting. You don't need constant noise. That's your compliment? It's a good compliment. I'll have to trust you. You should. She squeezed his hand. The simple gesture warmed him more than he expected. That moment stayed with him. Not because anything extraordinary happened. Because happiness often arrives quietly. The relationship continued, growing. Date after date. Conversation after conversation. Memory after memory. Before long, Robert realized something important. He wasn't simply falling for Olivia. He was building a life with her. The first time Olivia invited him to one of her family gatherings, she warned him several times. You sure about this? She asked. Robert laughed. You're acting like I'm entering a competition. You kind of are. That's reassuring. I'm serious. How bad can it be? Olivia nearly choked on her drink. That's exactly the attitude that's going to get you into trouble. The cookout took place at a relative's house. Music filled the backyard. Food covered nearly every available surface. Children ran through the grass. Conversations overlapped from every direction. Robert stood near the entrance looking completely overwhelmed. Olivia immediately noticed. Her smile widened. Oh no. What? You've got that look. What look? The look that says you're trying to process everything. There are like 50 conversations happening. Welcome to the family. Before Robert could respond, someone handed him a plate. Then another person handed him a different plate. A third person insisted he try something else. Within 5 minutes, he was carrying enough food to feed several people. I'm not sure this is physically possible. Nobody listened. At one point, an older woman studied him carefully. She shook her head. Robert wasn't sure why. Then she pointed toward his plate. You need more food. Robert blinked. More? You're too skinny. Olivia immediately turned away, laughing. Robert looked at his plate, then looked back. I'm carrying enough food for a small village. The older woman wasn't convinced. Several nearby relatives agreed with her. The debate lasted longer than Robert expected. Olivia found the entire situation hilarious. Unfortunately, things became even worse. A group nearby started a domino game. One of Olivia's relatives pointed toward Robert. Come sit. Robert smiled politely. I don't know how to play. The response generated immediate reactions. You don't know dominoes? No. Several people stared at him as if he had confessed never seeing a car before. Olivia laughed so hard she nearly dropped her drink. You're enjoying this way too much. A little. You could help. No chance. The next hour became a public lesson in dominoes. Robert lost repeatedly, spectacularly. Every time he made a mistake, somebody announced it loudly. Every time he lost, somebody celebrated. By the end of the game, even Robert was laughing. The competitive atmosphere wasn't mean. It was affectionate. Nobody treated him like an outsider. Nobody made him feel unwelcome. They teased him because he was already being included. As the evening continued, Robert sat back and watched everything around him. The conversations, the laughter, the music, the endless joking. People moved between groups effortlessly. Arguments started and ended within minutes. Someone always seemed to be laughing. Someone always seemed to be eating. The entire gathering felt alive, much different from the quiet environment where he had grown up. Yet somehow, he loved it. Later that evening, Olivia joined him near the edge of the yard. "You survived." "Barely." She laughed. "I warned you." "You did." "So? So what? What do you think?" Robert looked around once more. A child ran past carrying a football. Several relatives argued over food. Music continued playing nearby. The older woman, who had declared him too skinny, was still watching him occasionally, just in case he stopped eating. Robert smiled, then looked at Olivia. "I think I understand where you get it from." "Get what?" "The energy." Olivia laughed. "Fair answer." For a moment, Robert simply stood there taking everything in. Then a realization settled quietly into his mind. This wasn't just Olivia's family anymore. They were beginning to treat him like family too. And for the first time, Robert found himself imagining something he hadn't seriously considered in years. A future, not a career goal, not a financial plan. A real future, one that included Olivia. The funny thing about happiness is that most people don't notice it while they're living it. They notice it afterward. When something changes, when something is missing, when they find themselves wishing they could go back and enjoy an ordinary moment one more time. For nearly 3 years, Robert and Olivia built a life together, one routine at a time. Nothing happened overnight. There was no single moment when everything suddenly became serious. The relationship simply grew, steadily, naturally, until one day Robert looked around and realized Olivia had become part of nearly every corner of his life. Saturday mornings still belonged to coffee. Some habits never changed. One particular morning, Robert arrived at their usual coffee shop a few minutes early. Olivia was late. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was receiving a text message before she arrived. "Running behind. Don't order yet. Need 5 minutes." Robert smiled. 5 minutes from Olivia could mean anything. 10 minutes later, she rushed through the door. Her hair was slightly out of place. She looked like she'd hurried the entire way there. Robert checked his watch dramatically. 5 minutes? Olivia dropped into the chair. "I was optimistic." "You were fictional." She laughed. "I made it, didn't I?" "Barely." The conversation quickly shifted to lighter topics, as it usually did. Neither felt pressure to entertain the other. Neither felt the need to fill every silence. That comfort became one of the strongest parts of their relationship. Trust worked the same way. It wasn't built through grand speeches. It was built through consistency, keeping promises, showing up, listening, supporting each other, being present. The little things mattered. Robert learned that from Olivia. One evening, he arrived home after a particularly difficult day. A project at work had consumed nearly every hour of the week. He looked exhausted. Olivia took one look at him and immediately pointed toward the couch. "Sit." Robert frowned. "That's not a greeting. It's the greeting you're getting." "I can explain." "I don't want an explanation." She disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returned carrying food. Robert looked at her, then at the plate, then back at her. "You knew I'd have a bad day?" "No." "Then how?" Olivia shrugged. "I know you." The answer sounded simple, yet it meant more than she probably realized. That became the foundation of their relationship. Knowing each other, understanding each other, paying attention. Months became years. Their routines evolved. Beach walks continued. Movie nights continued. Coffee continued. Family gatherings continued. Life wasn't perfect. No relationship is. They occasionally disagreed. They occasionally frustrated each other. But disagreements never felt dangerous. There was always trust underneath them. Always respect. Always the confidence that they were on the same team. At least that's what Robert believed. Which is why he didn't immediately recognize the changes when they began. At first they seemed insignificant. Easy to explain. Easy to dismiss. One evening, Olivia received a phone call while they were eating dinner. She glanced at the screen. Something changed in her expression. Not fear, not panic, just concern. "I'll be right back." Robert nodded. No big deal. People received calls all the time. Several minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. Eventually, Olivia returned. She sat down, picked up her fork, and continued eating. Robert waited. Normally she would have explained, not because he demanded it, because that was simply how they communicated. This time she didn't. The silence felt unusual. Still, Robert didn't push. Everyone deserved privacy. The following week, something similar happened again. Another phone call. Another quick exit. Another private conversation. Again, she returned without explanation. Again, Robert ignored it. Not because he didn't notice. Because trust means allowing people space when they need it. A few days later, Olivia canceled plans unexpectedly. That was far more unusual. She almost never did that. Robert sat in his living room, staring at the message. "Sorry. Something came up. Can we do dinner tomorrow?" Simple enough. Reasonable enough. Yet he found himself reading it twice. Then 3 times. Not because the message was suspicious. Because something felt different. The next evening, Olivia arrived for dinner. She looked tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. The kind of tired that sits behind someone's eyes. Robert noticed immediately. "You okay?" Olivia smiled. "I'm fine." The answer arrived quickly. Almost too quickly. Robert studied her. "You sure?" "Yeah." A short pause followed. Then, Olivia changed the subject. The conversation moved elsewhere. Yet something about the exchange stayed with him. That wasn't the Olivia he knew. Usually, she shared things. Usually, she talked through problems. Usually, she let him help carry whatever was bothering her. Now, she seemed determined to carry everything herself. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Not every day. Not constantly. Just enough for Robert to notice. Phone calls. Distractions. Moments where Olivia seemed somewhere else, mentally. One afternoon, they were watching a movie together. Halfway through, Robert realized Olivia wasn't paying attention. She stared toward the television, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. "What happened?" Olivia blinked. "What?" "You've been staring at the same scene for 3 minutes." A small laugh escaped her. "Sorry. Something on your mind?" For a moment, she looked like she might answer honestly. Then she smiled. "I'm okay." The response sounded familiar now. Too familiar. Robert didn't challenge it. But concern quietly settled into the back of his mind. Not suspicion. Concern. Because the woman he loved looked increasingly overwhelmed, and he didn't know why. The situation became harder to ignore when Olivia began leaving unexpectedly. One Saturday morning, they had planned to spend the day together. Nothing elaborate. Breakfast. A walk. A lazy afternoon. The kind of simple day both enjoyed. Robert arrived with coffee. Olivia seemed distracted almost immediately. She checked her phone, then checked it again. A few minutes later, another notification appeared. Her shoulders tensed. Not dramatically, just enough for Robert to notice. Everything about Olivia's body language seemed different lately, like someone trying to solve a problem nobody else could see. Finally, she stood. "I need to take care of something." Robert looked up. "Now?" "It won't take long." "Everything okay?" The question lingered between them. Olivia hesitated. Just briefly, then smiled. The same tired smile he'd been seeing more often. "Yeah." Robert wanted to believe her. Part of him did, but another part couldn't ignore what he was seeing. Olivia grabbed her keys. her purse, her phone, then headed toward the door. Robert remained where he was, watching, waiting, expecting some kind of explanation. It never came. A moment later, the front door closed. Silence settled across the room. Robert stared toward the window. Seconds later, he watched Olivia drive away. And for the first time since they met, a feeling he hadn't experienced before quietly entered his mind. Concern. Real concern. Not because he doubted Olivia. Not because he stopped trusting her. Because something was clearly happening. Something important. Something heavy. And for the first time in nearly 3 years together, Robert realized he had absolutely no idea what it was. The following Saturday started like dozens of Saturdays before it. That was probably why Robert remembered it so clearly afterward. Nothing about the morning suggested it would become one of the most important days of his life. The weather was pleasant. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows. A light breeze drifted through the partially opened back door. The neighborhood outside moved at its usual pace. People walked their dogs. Cars passed occasionally. Everything felt ordinary. Olivia had left earlier that morning to take care of a few errands. At least that was what she told him. Robert hadn't questioned it. Lately he had been trying very hard not to question anything. The previous weeks had already filled his mind with enough uncertainty. He didn't want to become the type of person who searched for problems everywhere. So he focused on practical things. Laundry, cleaning, a few chores around the house. The kind of tasks people often postpone until the weekend. By early afternoon, he found himself gathering trash from around the kitchen. Nothing complicated, nothing important, just another small responsibility in an otherwise ordinary day. If someone had told him that a trash bag would change the direction of his thoughts for the next several weeks, he would have laughed. Yet that was exactly what happened. Robert tied the top of the bag and lifted it from the container. As he turned toward the garage, something caught his attention. At first he barely noticed it. A small white object rested near the top of the trash, beneath a layer of paper towels. He almost continued walking. Almost. Something made him pause. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps instinct. Even years later he couldn't explain why he stopped. He simply did. Setting the bag down, Robert leaned closer. The object looked familiar. Too familiar? His stomach tightened. For a second he told himself he was mistaken. There had to be another explanation. He moved the paper towels aside. The object became fully visible. A pregnancy test. Robert stared at it. 1 second passed. Then another. The world around him seemed to fade. He picked it up carefully. His eyes moved toward the result window. 2 lines. Clear. Undeniable. Positive. The words didn't register immediately. His brain saw the result before his emotions caught up. Then everything hit at once. A rush of questions. A rush of confusion. A rush of disbelief. Robert looked at the test again. Then again. As if somehow the answer might change. It didn't. He stood motionless in the kitchen. The silence around him suddenly felt enormous. His first thought wasn't anger. It wasn't even suspicion. It was shock. Because Olivia had never mentioned being pregnant. Not once. No conversation. No discussion. No excitement. No concern. Nothing. The discovery made no sense. And when something doesn't make sense, the mind begins searching for explanations. Fast. Robert sat down at the kitchen table. The pregnancy test remained in his hand. His thoughts immediately raced backward through the previous month. Olivia taking calls outside. Olivia leaving unexpectedly. Olivia staring into space during movie nights. Olivia checking her phone repeatedly. Olivia appearing emotionally exhausted. Small moments. Harmless moments. At least they had seemed harmless before. Now each memory returned carrying a different weight. Robert hated that. He hated how quickly his perspective changed. The same events that once looked ordinary suddenly appeared suspicious. He knew that wasn't fair, yet he couldn't stop himself. He pushed the pregnancy test across the table and rubbed both hands over his face. "What is going on?" he muttered. The question hung unanswered in the room. Hours passed. Olivia eventually returned home. The moment Robert heard the front door open, his heart immediately reacted. Part of him wanted to confront her. Part of him wanted to hold the pregnancy test in front of her and demand an explanation. Instead, he did nothing. He wasn't ready. Not yet. The conversation felt too important to rush. Olivia entered the kitchen carrying a grocery bag. She smiled when she saw him. Hey. The exchange sounded normal. Painfully normal. She unpacked groceries, asked whether he'd eaten lunch, talked briefly about traffic. Meanwhile, Robert watched her. Not openly, not obviously, but carefully, looking for something. Anything. A clue, a sign, a reason. Nothing appeared. Olivia seemed exactly like herself. That somehow made everything harder. Because if she was hiding something, she was hiding it well. That evening they ate dinner together. They watched television. They cleaned the kitchen. They discussed plans for the following week. The entire time, Robert carried the discovery alone. The secret sat inside his mind like a weight he couldn't put down. By bedtime, he felt exhausted. Not physically, mentally. He climbed into bed beside Olivia. The room was dark, quiet. Olivia fell asleep quickly. Robert didn't. He stared toward the ceiling. Minutes became hours. Questions replaced sleep. What if Olivia was pregnant? Why hadn't she told him? Was she afraid? Was she upset? Had something happened? The possibilities multiplied endlessly. Each answer seemed to create 3 new questions. At one point he turned toward Olivia. She slept peacefully beside him. For a brief moment, guilt reached him. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe he was worrying for nothing. Maybe everything would make sense tomorrow. He wanted to believe that. He truly did. But another part of him kept returning to the same uncomfortable fact. A positive pregnancy test existed, and Olivia had said nothing about it. By 3 o'clock in the morning, Robert finally accepted something he had been resisting all day. Whatever was happening, it wasn't small. Whatever explanation existed, it had been hidden for a reason. And for the first time since he met Olivia, Robert became convinced that something serious was being kept from him. The worst part wasn't finding the pregnancy test. The worst part came afterward. Because once a question enters your mind, it doesn't politely wait for an answer. It follows you into conversations, into quiet moments, into places where you least want it. Over the next several days, Robert tried convincing himself to act normally. At first, he believed he could do it. He would be patient. He would wait. He would give Olivia the opportunity to tell him whatever she was dealing with. That sounded reasonable. It sounded mature. It sounded exactly like the kind of approach he wanted to take. Unfortunately, reality was much harder. Every time Olivia glanced at her phone, Robert noticed. Every time she stepped outside to answer a call, he noticed. Every time she paused before answering a question, he noticed. The problem wasn't that she was behaving dramatically differently. The problem was that Robert had started paying attention in a way he never had before. One Tuesday evening they sat together after dinner. The television played quietly in the background. Neither was particularly interested in the program. Olivia's phone vibrated. She looked down. Immediately, something shifted in her expression. Not fear, not panic, concern. The same concern Robert had noticed before. She stood. "I need to take this." Robert nodded. "No problem." Olivia stepped outside. The back door closed behind her. A few seconds later, Robert heard her voice through the glass. Soft, careful, reassuring. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes. When she finally returned, she placed the phone on the counter and forced a smile. Everything about the smile felt tired, not fake, just exhausted. Robert studied her for a moment. "You sure you're okay?" There it was again. The question he seemed to be asking more often lately. Olivia looked at him. For a second he thought she might finally open up. Instead she nodded. "I'm okay." The answer arrived quickly. Too quickly. A few moments later, she redirected the conversation elsewhere. The opportunity disappeared. Robert let it go again. But each missed conversation left behind a small amount of frustration. Not because Olivia owed him every detail of her life, because she was clearly struggling with something, and she refused to let him help. A few days later, another opportunity appeared. They were driving home after dinner. Traffic moved slowly. Music played softly through the speakers. The atmosphere felt relaxed, comfortable. Robert decided to try again, carefully. "Can I ask you something?" Olivia glanced over. "You just did, despite everything." Robert laughed. The joke sounded familiar, normal. The kind of exchange they had always shared. That made what followed even harder. "You've seemed stressed lately." Olivia looked forward again. The smile faded. "Only slightly. I'm fine." "You keep saying that." "Because the first AM." A pause followed. "Not hostile. Not angry. Just uncomfortable." Robert kept his voice gentle. "If something's bothering you, you don't have to carry it alone." For several seconds, Olivia said nothing. The silence felt important. She gripped the steering wheel, loosened her grip, then sighed. Robert waited. His heart quietly lifted. Maybe this was it. Maybe she was finally ready to talk. Instead, she shook her head. "It's nothing I can't handle." The conversation ended there, not because Robert wanted it to, because Olivia refused to go further. The remainder of the drive felt different. Not cold, just distant, like two people standing on opposite sides of a closed door. As the days passed, Robert noticed another pattern. Olivia's trips away from home had become more frequent. Sometimes she left early. Sometimes she left unexpectedly. Sometimes she returned hours later, looking emotionally drained. Each trip carried the same vague explanations. Helping someone, taking care of something, meeting a friend. The explanations weren't impossible, yet they never felt complete. One Saturday morning, Robert happened to glance toward the kitchen counter, while Olivia was gathering her things. A folded paper sat beside her keys. She picked it up quickly, too quickly, almost as if she hadn't intended for him to see it. The movement caught his attention, not because of the paper itself, because of her reaction. Olivia rarely acted nervous around him. That small moment stayed with him long after she left. The same afternoon, Robert found himself replaying dozens of recent interactions. Conversations that ended abruptly, questions that went unanswered, plans that changed unexpectedly. He hated what was happening to him. He hated constantly searching for clues. This wasn't who he wanted to be. He didn't want his relationship to become an investigation. Yet every unanswered question pushed him closer to exactly that. One evening, Olivia arrived home later than expected. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that reaches beyond lack of sleep. She dropped her bag near the door and sat down heavily. Robert watched her. "You look worn out." Olivia rubbed her eyes. "It's been a long day." "What happened?" Again the opportunity appeared. Again it disappeared. Just a lot going on. Nothing more. No explanation. No details. No invitation into whatever burden she was carrying. The distance between them wasn't dramatic. That was what made it so dangerous. Distance rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it grows quietly, conversation by conversation, missed opportunity by missed opportunity, until one day, two people realize they're no longer sharing the same emotional space. A week later, Robert accidentally noticed something that changed the direction of his thoughts completely. Olivia was in the shower. Her phone sat charging on the kitchen counter. The screen briefly lit up with a travel notification. Robert wasn't trying to snoop. He wasn't even standing close. The city name simply caught his eye. Sacramento. His attention immediately sharpened. Sacramento? The notification disappeared before he could read anything else. At first, he dismissed it. Then another memory surfaced. A previous conversation. A comment Olivia had made weeks earlier. Another unexplained trip. Another absence. Another vague explanation. Suddenly, Sacramento appeared again. Then again. Then again. Robert walked into the living room and sat down slowly. The realization settled heavily in his chest. This wasn't a one-time visit. This wasn't a random errand. Sacramento had become a regular destination, and Olivia had never told him why. Before I continue, I want to hear your thoughts. If you were in Robert's position right now, would you confront Olivia immediately? Or would you wait for more answers? Let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Mr. George Stories. Your support helps these stories reach more people, and it means more than you know. Back in that living room, Robert stared at nothing for several long moments, because one thing had become impossible to ignore. The pregnancy test, the phone calls, the secrecy, the emotional exhaustion, and now Sacramento. For the first time, Robert realized this wasn't a collection of unrelated incidents. Something connected them. He just didn't know what. But he did know one thing. Sacramento was no longer an occasional trip. It had become a regular destination. That night, Robert sat alone in the living room long after Olivia had gone to bed. The television was on. He wasn't watching it. A half-finished glass of water rested on the coffee table. He hadn't touched it in nearly an hour. His thoughts kept returning to the same place. Sacramento. The pregnancy test. The unanswered questions. The growing distance between himself and Olivia. For the first time since all of this began, Robert felt genuinely conflicted about what he should do next. Not because he lacked questions. He had plenty of those. The problem was that every path forward felt wrong. If he confronted Olivia too aggressively, he could damage the trust they had spent years building. If he continued pretending everything was normal, he might never learn the truth. Neither option felt good. He leaned back against the couch and closed his eyes. A memory surfaced. One of those ordinary moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. Months earlier, Olivia had laughed at something ridiculous during one of their weekend coffee runs. The sound had filled the room. People nearby had smiled without knowing why. Robert remembered looking at her and thinking how lucky he was. Now he found himself wondering how they had gone from that moment to this one. How had they become two people, sitting only a few feet apart, while carrying entirely different realities? The thought bothered him more than he wanted to admit, because despite everything, he still trusted Olivia. At least he wanted to. The problem was that trust becomes difficult when information is missing. The following morning, Robert woke up, determined to stop paying attention to every detail. He wasn't proud of the direction his thoughts had taken. He didn't want to become suspicious. He didn't want to become controlling. Most importantly, he didn't want to become someone Olivia wouldn't recognize. So he made a promise to himself. No more looking for clues. No more analyzing every conversation. No more searching for hidden meanings. The promise lasted less than 3 days. Not because Robert wanted to break it, because new questions kept appearing. One afternoon he was cleaning the kitchen when he noticed a receipt sitting near a stack of unopened mail. Normally he would have ignored it. This time his eyes landed on a detail before he could stop himself. Sacramento. The location stood out immediately. Robert picked up the receipt. His pulse quickened. It wasn't anything dramatic. Just a purchase. Something ordinary. The kind of transaction most people forget within hours. Yet seeing Sacramento printed on the paper confirmed something important. Olivia wasn't making occasional visits. She was going there repeatedly. Robert stared at the receipt for several seconds before placing it back exactly where he found it. A wave of guilt hit him, almost immediately. This wasn't who he wanted to be. Looking at receipts, analyzing travel patterns, searching for answers in everyday objects. The behavior felt uncomfortable. Yet so did remaining completely in the dark. That contradiction followed him throughout the week. Every time he convinced himself to stop looking, another unanswered question appeared. One evening, Olivia mentioned plans for Saturday. Robert listened carefully. The explanation sounded simple enough. A few errands. A busy afternoon. Nothing unusual. Then later that night, he happened to glance at a calendar hanging near the kitchen. Something didn't match. The date she referenced wasn't marked. Another commitment appeared instead. A commitment she had never mentioned. Robert frowned. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe she had forgotten to update the calendar. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. The problem was that lately everything seemed to require an explanation. and explanations were becoming harder to find. Over the next several days, the pattern continued. Small inconsistencies, tiny details, nothing powerful enough to stand alone. Yet together they formed something larger. A growing sense that Olivia was carrying an important secret. One evening, Robert sat on the back patio after dinner. The sun was beginning to disappear beyond the horizon. The air felt cool, peaceful. Olivia joined him a few minutes later. For a while, neither spoke. They simply sat together, the way they had done countless times before. Robert glanced toward her. She looked tired again. Not physically, emotionally, like someone carrying a responsibility that never allowed her to fully relax. The sight immediately softened something inside him, because despite his frustration, he still loved her deeply. That had never changed. Maybe that was why this situation hurt so much. He wasn't trying to solve a mystery involving a stranger. He was trying to understand someone who mattered to him. Someone he had imagined building a future with. Someone he still imagined building a future with. Olivia looked over and caught him staring. What? Robert smiled faintly. Nothing. You always say that. You always ask. A small laugh escaped her. For a moment, things felt normal again. Almost. Then her phone vibrated. The change was immediate. Olivia looked down. Read the screen. The brief smile disappeared. Not completely. Just enough for Robert to notice. Again. Always. The same pattern. Concern. Urgency. Distraction. She stood. I need to take this. Robert nodded. Okay. Olivia stepped away. A few moments later, he heard her voice in the distance. Soft. Reassuring. Patient. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes. When she returned, she seemed even more exhausted than before. The sight stayed with him, not because it confirmed any particular theory, because it reminded him that whatever was happening was affecting her deeply. That realization complicated everything. Part of him felt frustrated. Part of him felt worried. Part of him felt guilty for questioning her. And another part desperately wanted answers. The emotional conflict became exhausting. Every day he moved between trust and doubt, hope and fear, patience and frustration. One moment he convinced himself there was a reasonable explanation. The next moment he remembered the pregnancy test. Then Sacramento. Then the secrecy. Then another unanswered question. The cycle repeated endlessly. By the end of the week, Robert found himself standing alone in the kitchen late at night. The house was quiet. Olivia had already gone upstairs. He rested both hands against the counter and stared toward the dark window. For weeks, he had waited. For weeks, he had given Olivia opportunities to talk. For weeks, he had tried convincing himself that everything would eventually make sense on its own. It hadn't. The questions remained. The distance remained. The uncertainty remained. And for the first time, Robert accepted a difficult truth. Doing nothing was no longer protecting the relationship. Doing nothing was slowly damaging it. Because every unanswered question created another barrier between them. Every secret added another layer of confusion. Every missed conversation pushed them slightly farther apart. Robert closed his eyes and took a long breath. He didn't want an argument. He didn't want accusations. He didn't want drama. He wanted honesty. He wanted understanding. Most of all, he wanted the woman he loved back. When he finally opened his eyes, his decision had been made. Whatever the truth was, he needed to hear it, before fear completely replaced trust. Before assumptions caused damage neither of them could undo. Before the relationship they had spent years building broke under the weight of things left unsaid. For the first time since finding the pregnancy test, Robert stopped waiting for answers to appear on their own. He decided he was going to find them. Robert didn't wake up that morning, planning to follow Olivia. Even afterward, he wasn't proud of it. For days, he tried convincing himself not to. He told himself he needed patience. He told himself trust mattered. He told himself there had to be a reasonable explanation for everything. But patience becomes difficult when answers never come. And trust becomes difficult when communication disappears. That Saturday began like several others had recently. Olivia seemed distracted before breakfast. She checked her phone repeatedly. Every notification seemed to pull her attention somewhere else. Robert noticed. He tried not to, but noticing had become impossible. Around mid-morning, Olivia glanced at the clock and stood. "I need to head out." Robert looked up from his coffee. "For long?" "I'm not sure." The answer wasn't unusual anymore. That was part of the problem. 3 months earlier, the response wouldn't have bothered him. Now it did. Not because she was leaving, because she rarely explained where she was going. Olivia grabbed her purse and keys. Then she leaned down and kissed his cheek. The gesture felt familiar, comforting, normal. Yet even that normal moment couldn't erase the questions living in Robert's mind. "I'll see you later," she said. "Drive safe." A few moments later she was gone. Robert remained at the kitchen table. For several minutes he stared at his untouched coffee. Part of him wanted to spend the day exactly as planned. Run errands, watch a game, do anything except think about Olivia's secretive behavior. Instead he found himself looking toward the window, then toward the clock, then back toward the driveway. A quiet battle played out inside him. One side argued that following her was wrong. The other side reminded him that weeks had passed without answers. Eventually, frustration won. Not anger, not jealousy, frustration. Because he felt shut out of the life he and Olivia had built together. An hour later, Robert found himself driving north. The decision felt uncomfortable from the moment he made it. Several times he nearly turned around. Several times he told himself this was a mistake. Yet he continued. As the miles passed, one destination became impossible to ignore. Sacramento. The city appeared again, just as it had before. Just as the receipts suggested. Just as the travel notifications hinted. For the first time, Robert had confirmation. Olivia wasn't making random trips. She was deliberately coming here. The question was why. The answer arrived sooner than expected. Late that afternoon, Robert spotted Olivia near a small cafe. His stomach tightened. Not because he had caught her doing anything wrong. Because this was the first real clue he had seen. He parked farther away and remained inside his vehicle. From there, he had a clear view through the cafe windows. Olivia sat at a corner table. Across from her sat a young woman. Robert immediately knew he had never seen her before. The woman looked much younger than Olivia. Nervous too. Very nervous. She kept looking toward the entrance, then toward the windows, then down at her hands. The behavior caught Robert's attention immediately. She wasn't relaxed. She wasn't enjoying a casual lunch with a friend. She looked overwhelmed, almost frightened. At one point, she rubbed her eyes quickly, as though she didn't want anyone noticing she had been crying. Robert leaned forward slightly, trying to understand what he was seeing. Olivia spoke calmly, patiently. Whatever she was saying seemed intended to comfort the young woman. The interaction felt strangely protective. That observation immediately complicated everything. If Robert had expected romantic behavior, he didn't see it. No flirting, no hidden affection, no body language suggesting an affair. Nothing remotely close. Instead, Olivia looked concerned. The same concern Robert had noticed during phone calls. The same concern he had seen during recent weeks. Only now he understood where some of that concern was being directed. Toward this woman. Several minutes passed. The young woman lowered her head. Olivia reached across the table. Not dramatically. Not romantically. Simply offering reassurance. The gesture felt supportive. Almost sisterly. The thought surprised Robert. He immediately dismissed it. There was no reason to jump to conclusions. Not anymore. He had already done enough of that. Inside the cafe, the conversation continued. The young woman appeared emotional. Olivia listened carefully, occasionally speaking, occasionally nodding, mostly listening. The scene confused Robert more than anything else, because what he was witnessing didn't fit any of the explanations he had imagined. Not one. For weeks his mind had constructed theories, some reasonable, some ridiculous. Now every theory seemed weaker, Yet no clear answer replaced them. The mystery had changed shape. That was all. After nearly an hour, both women stood. The young woman looked slightly calmer than before. Not happy, not relieved, just calmer. Olivia hugged her briefly. Again, the gesture felt protective, supportive. Nothing more. The two walked toward the parking lot. Robert quickly looked away. The last thing he wanted was to be seen. A few moments later, Olivia drove away. The young woman left separately. Robert remained parked where he was, staring through the windshield, trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. If the pregnancy test belonged to Olivia, why involve this woman? If the woman was connected to the pregnancy test, who was she? Why was Olivia helping her? Why keep everything secret? Each answer seemed to create 3 new questions. Eventually, Robert started the engine. The drive home felt longer than usual, not because of traffic, because his mind refused to settle. The Sacramento trip had provided something important, a real clue. Unfortunately, the clue only made the situation harder to understand. And by the time Robert pulled into his driveway that evening, one truth had become painfully clear. He had more questions than ever before. The drive back from Sacramento stayed with Robert longer than he expected, not because he had discovered something shocking. The opposite. What bothered him most was that what he saw didn't match the story he had been preparing himself to believe. The young woman hadn't looked like someone involved in a secret romance. She looked overwhelmed, lost, like a person carrying more weight than she could manage alone. And Olivia had looked protective, patient, concerned. The same concern Robert had been seeing for weeks. Only now, he knew where some of it was going. Yet, knowing that should have made him feel better. Instead, it created an entirely new set of questions. The rest of the weekend passed quietly, too quietly. On Sunday evening, Robert and Olivia sat together watching television. At least, that was what appeared to be happening. Neither was actually paying attention. The program continued playing. Characters spoke. Scenes changed. Neither seemed aware of any of it. Robert found himself glancing toward Olivia. Olivia found herself staring toward the television without really seeing it. The distance between them felt different now. Not hostile, not angry, just heavy. Like two people standing on opposite sides of a conversation neither knew how to start. Several times Robert considered bringing up Sacramento. Several times he stopped himself. He wasn't ready, not yet. And deep down he still hoped Olivia would tell him on her own. Monday arrived. Then Tuesday. Then Wednesday. The secret remained exactly where it had always been. Between them, one evening Robert arrived home earlier than expected. The house was quiet. Olivia was sitting on the couch with a blanket draped across her lap. A book rested beside her. She wasn't reading it. She seemed lost in thought. Robert set his keys down. Olivia looked up and smiled. The smile appeared genuine. That somehow made things harder, because despite everything, moments like this reminded him why he loved her. The mystery existed. The confusion existed, but so did years of memories, years of trust, years of happiness. He sat beside her. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, at least not initially. Then Robert made a decision, not a confrontation, just an attempt, a small step toward reconnecting. You remember that coffee place near the beach? Olivia looked over. The one where you spent 30 minutes arguing that cereal isn't soup. Robert laughed. That's still one of the worst opinions you've ever had. My opinion was correct. It wasn't. It absolutely was. For the first time all evening Olivia laughed. A real laugh. The sound immediately reminded Robert of how things used to feel. Easy, natural, uncomplicated. The moment lasted only a few seconds, yet it mattered, because it reminded him they were still there beneath all the confusion, still themselves, still Robert and Olivia. Eventually, the laughter faded. Silence returned. This time, Robert didn't let it sit. I miss you. The words came out quietly. Olivia blinked. What? Robert looked down briefly, then back at her. I miss you. The room became very still. Olivia didn't answer immediately. Her expression softened. Pain flashed across her face. Not anger, not annoyance. Pain. As if hearing those words hurt more than she expected. Robert continued carefully. I know you've got something going on. Olivia lowered her eyes. The response stopped. Robert waited. For weeks, he had been waiting. Now he listened. Really listened. Because something in her voice felt different. More vulnerable. More fragile. I don't know how to. Again she stopped. The unfinished sentence lingered between them. Robert's heart began beating faster. Not from fear, from hope. For the first time in weeks, it felt like Olivia might finally tell him what was happening. She stared at her hands, thinking, choosing her words carefully. Several long seconds passed. Then another. Robert remained silent, giving her space, giving her time. Olivia took a breath. Then another. Tears appeared in her eyes unexpectedly. Not enough to fall. Just enough to catch the light. Robert felt his chest tighten. Whatever burden she was carrying, it was clearly affecting her deeply. I've wanted to tell you. The words barely rose above a whisper. Robert leaned forward slightly. Every instinct told him to stay quiet. Don't interrupt. Don't push. Just listen. Olivia swallowed. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor. It's just... Again. She stopped. The unfinished sentence felt almost painful. Because Robert could see the battle happening inside her. Part of her wanted to speak. Part of her couldn't. The struggle showed in every hesitation, every pause, every glance away. For a moment, Robert thought she was finally going to say it. The truth. Whatever truth existed. Instead, Olivia closed her eyes. Took a shaky breath. Then shook her head. I can't. The words landed heavily. Robert stared at her. Not angry. Not disappointed. Just hurt. Because she had come so close. Close enough for him to see it. Close enough for him to believe the wall between them was finally coming down. Only for it to rise again. Stronger than before. Olivia wiped at her eyes quickly. I'm sorry. Robert looked away, trying to process everything. The apology somehow made things worse. Because apologies usually follow explanations. This one arrived alone. The room grew quiet again. Neither seemed to know what to say next. The silence stretched. Long. Uncomfortable. Painful. Robert could feel the distance widening again. Not because either of them wanted it. Because neither knew how to cross it. Eventually, Olivia stood. I think I'm going to bed. Robert nodded. Okay. She hesitated, as if wanting to say more. Then she simply turned and walked toward the stairs. A few moments later, he heard the bedroom door close. Robert remained on the couch. Alone. The conversation replayed repeatedly in his mind. Not the words. The hesitation. The emotion. The fear. For weeks, he had assumed Olivia didn't want to tell him. Now, he wasn't so sure. The woman he saw tonight looked like someone desperately trying to speak. Someone standing at the edge of a confession. Someone trapped between honesty and fear. That realization changed everything. Because for the first time, Robert stopped wondering whether Olivia was hiding something. Of course she was. That much was obvious. The real question was why she seemed unable to say it out loud. And sitting alone in the quiet living room, Robert finally understood something important. Olivia wanted to tell him the truth. She just couldn't bring herself to do it. After the conversation on the couch, something changed inside Robert. Not dramatically, not overnight, but enough for him to notice. For weeks he had been focused on what Olivia wasn't telling him. Now he found himself paying closer attention to something else. How much whatever she was hiding seemed to be hurting her. That realization didn't erase his questions. It didn't erase the pregnancy test. It didn't erase Sacramento. It simply added another layer to the situation. Because the woman he loved no longer looked like someone protecting a secret for her own benefit. She looked like someone carrying a burden she didn't know how to share. The days that followed felt strangely fragile. Both of them moved carefully around each other. Neither wanted conflict. Neither wanted another painful conversation that ended without answers. So they settled into an uneasy rhythm. Normal conversations, normal routines, normal smiles. Yet underneath it all sat the same unanswered questions. One Thursday evening, Robert arrived home later than usual. Work had been demanding. His shoulders ached. His head hurt. All he wanted was a quiet evening. The house seemed empty when he stepped inside. At first he assumed Olivia wasn't home yet. Then he heard her voice, soft, emotional, coming from the back patio. Robert set his keys down quietly. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop. In fact, he almost turned away. Then a sentence drifted through the partially opened door. "It's okay. We'll figure it out." The words immediately caught his attention, not because of what was said, because of how Olivia said it. Her voice carried the same protective tone he had witnessed in Sacramento, the same careful reassurance. Robert remained where he was, frozen. A second voice responded, a young woman's voice, shaky, barely holding together. The sound alone made his stomach tighten. The woman sounded frightened, not nervous, not stressed, frightened. For several seconds, Robert stood motionless. He knew he should walk away, give Olivia privacy, respect the conversation. Yet before he could move, another sentence reached him. "I don't know where I'm supposed to go." The young woman's voice cracked. A sob followed. Robert's attention sharpened instantly. Olivia answered without hesitation, "You're not alone." Silence. Then, more crying. Robert frowned. Every assumption he had built over the previous weeks began shifting, slowly, uneasily, because this didn't sound like a secret relationship. It sounded like a crisis. Outside, Olivia continued speaking. "We'll figure out the housing situation." Housing. The word landed heavily. Robert remained still. The conversation suddenly felt very different from what he expected. The young woman sniffled. "What if I can't afford it? You don't need to solve everything today." Olivia's voice stayed calm, steady, supportive. Exactly like it had been in the cafe. Exactly like it had been during every private phone call. Robert listened carefully. The pieces still didn't fit together, but the picture was changing. A few moments later, another phrase drifted through the doorway. "The appointment went better than I expected." The young woman sounded slightly calmer. Olivia released what sounded like a relieved breath. "See? I told you it would." Appointment. Robert immediately thought back to Sacramento. The repeated trips, the emotional exhaustion, the concern, the fear. Everything seemed connected, just not in the way he originally believed. The conversation continued. The young woman spoke quietly, sometimes crying, sometimes apologizing, sometimes sounding completely overwhelmed. Throughout all of it, Olivia remained patient, listening, encouraging, reassuring. At one point, the young woman whispered something Robert couldn't hear. Olivia answered immediately. "No. Stop saying that." The response came firmly, more firmly than anything else she had said. A brief silence followed. Then Olivia softened her tone. "You're doing the best you can." Another pause. More crying. Robert leaned against the kitchen counter. His mind raced. Not with accusations. Not anymore. With confusion. Because nothing about this sounded romantic. Nothing about this sounded deceptive in the way he had feared. Instead, it sounded like Olivia was helping someone who was struggling. Helping someone who felt alone. Helping someone who desperately needed support. That realization hit him harder than he expected. Because it forced him to confront something uncomfortable. For weeks, he had allowed his imagination to fill the gaps. When answers were missing, he created possibilities. When explanations didn't exist, he invented them. Now those possibilities looked increasingly weak. The conversation outside continued for nearly another 20 minutes. Robert didn't catch every detail, only fragments. References to paperwork, references to appointments, references to finding stability, references to fear about the future. The emotional weight in the young woman's voice never fully disappeared. Neither did Olivia's determination to help. Eventually, the call began winding down. The crying lessened. The conversation became calmer. Finally, Olivia said something that stayed with Robert long afterward. "We'll take this one step at a time." Simple words, yet they carried enormous meaning, because they weren't the words of someone hiding an affair. They were the words of someone trying to protect another person. The call ended shortly afterward. Robert quickly moved away from the doorway. He didn't want Olivia realizing he had overheard anything. A few moments later, she entered the kitchen. Her eyes looked tired. Her shoulders sagged slightly. She appeared emotionally drained, the same way she had appeared for weeks. Only now Robert understood a little more about why. Olivia noticed him immediately. "When did you get home?" "A few minutes ago." She nodded. For a brief second, neither spoke. Then, Olivia managed a small smile. "Long day?" Robert looked at her. Really looked at her. The exhaustion, the concern, the emotional weight she carried. And for the first time since finding the pregnancy test, his assumptions shifted in a completely different direction. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It was." Olivia nodded again, then headed toward the refrigerator. The moment passed, but Robert remained standing there, thinking, processing, reevaluating everything. The mystery still existed. The pregnancy test still existed. Sacramento still existed. The secret still existed. Yet one theory had become much harder to believe. The idea that Olivia was hiding some romantic betrayal no longer fit the evidence. Not after what he had heard. Not after what he had seen. Not after witnessing her comfort, a terrified young woman who seemed to have nowhere else to turn. Before we continue, I want to hear your thoughts. At this point in the story, what do you think is really happening? Do you still believe Robert's original fears? Or do you think Olivia is protecting someone? Leave your theory in the comments below. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Mr. George Stories. Your support helps these stories reach more people and keeps this community growing. Later that evening, Robert sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet again, but for the first time in weeks, his thoughts were moving in a different direction. Not toward betrayal, toward concern. Because whatever secret Olivia was carrying seemed connected to someone who was frightened, someone who needed housing, someone attending medical appointments, someone relying heavily on Olivia's support. And as Robert replayed the conversation in his mind, one possibility rose above all the others. This mystery wasn't centered around Olivia. It was centered around the young woman. And for the first time, Robert began to wonder if the real story involved someone who might genuinely be in trouble. The decision wasn't made in a single moment. It arrived gradually, built from sleepless nights, unfinished conversations, questions that refused to leave him alone. By the time Robert finally accepted what needed to happen, he felt exhausted, not angry, exhausted, because carrying uncertainty for weeks had become heavier than whatever answer waited on the other side. That realization followed him throughout the day. He tried focusing on work, failed. Tried distracting himself with routine tasks, failed again. Every thought returned to the same place. Olivia, the woman in Sacramento, the pregnancy test, the conversation he knew could no longer be postponed. For weeks, he had waited. For weeks he had given Olivia opportunities to tell him the truth herself. Now he understood something important. Waiting wasn't helping either of them. Whatever secret existed had already created distance. The only way forward was through it. That evening Robert arrived home before Olivia. The house was quiet. For several minutes he stood in the kitchen staring at nothing. His reflection stared back from the dark window. He barely recognized himself. The version of him standing there looked tired, worried, older somehow. Not because of age, because uncertainty has a way of wearing people down. He poured a glass of water, didn't drink it, sat at the kitchen table, stood again, walked into the living room, then back into the kitchen. The nervous energy surprised him. He had rehearsed this conversation countless times. Yet now that it was finally happening, he wasn't sure where to begin. A short time later, he heard Olivia's car pull into the driveway. His heart immediately reacted. The familiar sound that once brought comfort now brought anxiety. A few moments later, the front door opened. Olivia stepped inside. She looked tired again, the same exhaustion Robert had been noticing for weeks. She placed her purse near the door. "Hey, hey." The greeting sounded normal, almost painfully normal. Olivia walked toward the kitchen. "How was your day?" Robert looked at her. For a second, he nearly changed his mind, nearly pushed the conversation to another day, another week, another opportunity. Then he remembered how many times he had already done that. Too many. "We need to talk." The words came out calmly. Not harsh, not aggressive, just honest. Olivia stopped walking. Immediately. The change in her expression was impossible to miss. Not fear, recognition. As though part of her had known this moment was coming. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Olivia nodded. "Okay." The response surprised him. No defensiveness, no frustration, just acceptance. They moved into the living room, the same couch, where countless ordinary conversations had taken place over the years. Tonight felt different. Neither sat immediately. Eventually, Olivia settled onto one end. Robert took the opposite side. The distance between them suddenly felt much larger than a few feet. Silence filled the room. Not hostile silence, careful silence. Both searching for the right words. Robert spoke first. "I don't know what's happening anymore." Olivia lowered her eyes. The reaction hurt more than he expected, because she didn't deny it. She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. "I know something is wrong." Still silence. Robert continued. His voice remained calm. "I've tried giving you space." Olivia swallowed hard. "I know. I've tried waiting." Another nod. "I know. I've tried trusting that eventually you'd tell me." For a moment, Olivia squeezed her eyes shut. The pain on her face was immediate, visible, real. Robert saw it. And despite everything, part of him wanted to stop, because hurting her was never his goal. The problem was that staying silent was hurting both of them. The room remained quiet. Neither seemed sure where to go next. Then, Olivia spoke, softly. "I'm sorry." The apology landed heavily, not because it answered anything, because it sounded sincere, completely sincere. Robert rubbed his hands together, trying to steady himself, trying to find the courage to say the thing he had carried alone for weeks. His stomach tightened. The memory returned instantly. The kitchen, the trash bag, the discovery that had started everything. For several seconds he stared toward the coffee table, then back at Olivia. This was it, the moment he could no longer avoid. His voice dropped slightly, carefully, almost reluctantly. "Olivia." She looked up, tears already beginning to gather in her eyes. Robert took a slow breath, then finally said the words he had been holding inside for weeks. "I found the pregnancy test." The room went completely still. Olivia froze. Every trace of color seemed to leave her face. The silence that followed felt endless. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Robert watched the realization reach her. Watched her understand exactly which pregnancy test he meant. Watched the secret she had been carrying suddenly become impossible to hide. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, everything was finally out in the open. For several seconds after Robert spoke, neither of them moved. The room felt frozen. Olivia stared at him. Robert stared back. The words were finally out. No more guessing. No more pretending. No more carrying the discovery alone. Yet instead of feeling relieved, Robert suddenly felt nervous, because now the truth had a chance to enter the room. And truth changes everything. Olivia lowered her eyes. The reaction wasn't what Robert expected. There was no anger, no defensiveness, no attempt to explain anything away. Instead, her shoulders sagged, as if she had been holding something heavy for so long that she could no longer support the weight. Robert watched her carefully. For weeks, he had imagined this conversation. He had imagined arguments, denials, accusations. Nothing prepared him for this. Olivia looked exhausted, completely exhausted. One tear slipped down her cheek. then another. She didn't wipe them away. She simply sat there, breathing, trying to steady herself. The silence stretched between them. Robert felt his chest tighten, not because he wanted answers, because seeing her like this hurt. Despite everything that had happened, he still loved her. That hadn't changed. And right now, she looked like someone standing at the edge of emotional collapse. Finally, Olivia spoke. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "How long?" Robert understood immediately. "Since the day I found it." Olivia closed her eyes. The answer clearly hit her hard. Weeks. An entire stretch of weeks. Weeks where Robert carried questions. Weeks where she carried secrets. Weeks where both suffered in silence. A painful laugh escaped her unexpectedly. Not amusement. The kind of laugh people make when they don't know whether to cry harder or completely fall apart. "Oh God." The words sounded broken. Robert remained quiet. For the first time since this started, he wasn't interested in presenting evidence. He wasn't interested in listing clues. He wasn't interested in proving anything. He simply wanted to understand. Olivia rubbed her face, then covered her eyes completely. The gesture lasted several seconds. When she finally lowered her hands, more tears followed. "I'm so sorry." The apology came out stronger this time. More emotional, more desperate. Robert leaned forward slightly. "Help me understand." That was all he said. No accusation, no judgment, just a request. "Help me understand." The words seemed to affect Olivia immediately, because for the first time she looked directly at him, really looked at him, and what Robert saw in her expression surprised him. Fear, not fear of being caught. Fear of losing something important. Fear of losing him. The realization shifted something inside him. For weeks he had viewed himself as the one suffering. Now he saw evidence that Olivia had been suffering too, just differently. The room fell quiet again. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Inside the house, neither seemed aware of anything beyond the conversation. Olivia finally took a deep breath, then another, as if preparing herself for something difficult. "I never wanted this." Robert listened. Every word mattered now. "I never wanted you to find out that way." Her voice cracked. A fresh wave of emotion followed. Robert said nothing. He simply listened, the way he wished they had been able to talk weeks ago. Olivia shook her head slowly. "I kept telling myself I'd tell you." The confession came quietly. "I planned to." Another pause. "I just kept waiting for the right time." Robert understood the trap immediately. Because sometimes people delay difficult conversations, not because they don't want to tell the truth, because they become afraid of the consequences. Then each day makes the conversation harder, and harder, and harder, until the silence becomes its own prison. Olivia wiped her eyes again. This time her hands trembled slightly. "I didn't know how." The vulnerability in her voice filled the room. Gone was the composed woman who had been carefully managing everything for weeks. Gone was the woman who kept saying she was fine. Now Robert was finally seeing the pressure she had been carrying, and it was enormous. Another long silence followed. Not uncomfortable, not hostile, just emotional. The kind of silence that happens when words struggle to keep up with feelings. Eventually Robert spoke, carefully. "Did you think I'd leave?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Olivia immediately looked away. That reaction answered more than any words could. Robert felt a sharp ache in his chest. Because beneath all the mystery, beneath all the secrecy, beneath all the confusion, there was something much simpler. Fear. Olivia had been afraid. Afraid of his reaction. Afraid of changing their life. Afraid of introducing something complicated into a relationship that had always felt stable. The realization hurt. Not because she feared him, because she feared losing him. A fresh tear rolled down Olivia's cheek. "I didn't know what would happen." Robert looked down briefly, then back at her. For several moments, neither spoke. The conversation felt less like a confrontation now, more like two people standing in the wreckage of weeks of misunderstanding, trying to find each other again, trying to rebuild a bridge that silence had damaged. Olivia took another deep breath. The movement seemed deliberate, as though she had reached a decision. Robert noticed immediately something was changing. The hesitation remained. The fear remained. Yet underneath both was determination. For the first time all evening, Olivia appeared ready to stop carrying the burden alone. She sat forward, hands clasped tightly together, eyes filled with emotion. Then she finally said the words Robert had been waiting weeks to hear. "There is something I've been hiding." The sentence hung in the air, heavy, powerful, unavoidable. Robert's pulse quickened, not from panic, from anticipation, because after weeks of confusion, assumptions, and unanswered questions, the truth was finally beginning to emerge. And whatever came next would change everything. "There is something I've been hiding." The words lingered between them. For weeks, Robert had waited to hear them. Now that they were finally spoken, he realized something surprising. He wasn't angry. He wasn't preparing for a fight. He simply wanted to understand. Olivia sat quietly for several moments. Her hands remained clasped together. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Robert didn't interrupt, didn't rush her, didn't fill the silence. Whatever she was about to say had clearly cost her weeks of emotional exhaustion. She deserved the chance to say it in her own way. Eventually, Olivia took a slow breath, then another. When she finally spoke again, her voice sounded steadier. Not because the conversation had become easier, because she had finally decided to stop carrying it alone. "A few months ago, I ordered one of those DNA ancestry tests." Robert blinked. Of all the explanations he had imagined, that wasn't one of them. Olivia noticed his expression. A small, sad smile briefly appeared. "I know." Robert remained silent. The story was already heading somewhere he never expected. It started as curiosity. Olivia looked down at her hands. "I wanted to learn more about family history." She shrugged slightly. "The usual reasons people do those tests." Robert nodded. Nothing about that sounded unusual. Nothing about it explained Sacramento. Nothing about it explained the pregnancy test. Yet he trusted that the pieces were coming. Olivia continued. "I mailed the sample." A brief pause. "Then I forgot about it." Another pause. "Until the results came back." This time her voice changed. The emotion returned immediately. Robert noticed. Whatever happened next mattered. A lot. The report showed a close family match. Robert frowned slightly. Olivia swallowed hard. "A half-sister?" The room became quiet again. Robert stared at her, not because he doubted what she was saying, because the information landed unexpectedly. A half-sister? Someone Olivia had never mentioned. Someone Robert had never heard about. Someone who apparently didn't exist in Olivia's understanding of her own family history. "I didn't know she existed." The statement came quickly, as if Olivia wanted him to understand that immediately. "I had never heard her name." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I had no idea." Robert slowly leaned back against the couch. Suddenly, pieces began shifting inside his mind. Not fitting together yet, just moving, creating space for a different explanation. Olivia continued. "At first, I thought there had to be a mistake." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "The results didn't make sense." She laughed softly, a humorless laugh. "The entire thing felt impossible." Robert understood. A discovery like that would shake anyone, especially someone who believed they understood their family history. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. The question was the first thing he had said in several minutes. Olivia looked up briefly. "I ignored it." Another sad smile appeared. "For about a week." Robert almost laughed. The answer sounded surprisingly human. "I told myself it had to be wrong." She shook her head. "But I kept thinking about it." The curiosity eventually won. The need for answers won. And before long, Olivia found herself reaching out, carefully, cautiously, not knowing what would happen. "I sent a message." Robert listened closely. Every piece mattered now. "I didn't expect a response." A short pause. I got one. The memory clearly affected her. Not negatively, emotionally, deeply. Olivia looked away for a moment, then continued. We started talking. The conversations began slowly. Two strangers connected by blood. Two people trying to understand how they fit into each other's lives. Questions led to more questions. Documents followed. Information was compared. Stories were shared. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. The DNA test had been right. The connection was real. The half-sister existed. And after enough conversations, they eventually agreed to meet. Robert immediately thought back to Sacramento. The trips, the secrecy, the emotional investment, the protective behavior. The puzzle pieces continued moving. Olivia saw the realization forming. That woman you saw. Robert's attention sharpened immediately. The woman from the cafe. The frightened woman. The woman from the phone calls. The woman connected to Sacramento. Olivia nodded slowly. That's my half-sister. For several seconds, Robert said nothing. The revelation completely changed the shape of the story. Not because it answered everything, because it transformed everything. The mystery wasn't centered around a hidden romance. It wasn't centered around betrayal. It wasn't centered around deception. It was centered around family. A family member Olivia never knew existed. A family member who suddenly appeared in her life. Robert exhaled slowly. The tension inside him shifted again. Not disappearing. Changing. What happened? He asked. The question came softly. Olivia's eyes immediately filled with emotion. And this time, Robert knew the answer wasn't going to be easy. When we met, her voice cracked. She paused, collected herself, then continued. When we met, I realized how difficult her life had been. The details emerged gradually. Years of instability. Years without reliable support. Years spent moving from one difficult situation to another. The more Olivia learned, the harder it became to walk away, because this wasn't a distant relative. This wasn't an abstract DNA result. This was family. Real family. Someone who had spent years navigating life alone. Robert listened carefully. Everything he had witnessed suddenly made more sense. The fear, the concern, the repeated trips, the emotional exhaustion. Olivia wasn't managing a secret relationship. She was trying to help someone who desperately needed support. Then Olivia reached the part she had been avoiding. The part that connected everything. The part that connected Sacramento. The part that connected the phone calls. The part that connected the object Robert found in the trash. Her eyes dropped again. A fresh tear rolled down her cheek. When we met, she was already struggling. A pause. Then things became even harder. Robert remained silent, waiting, listening. Olivia finally looked up and spoke the sentence that changed everything. She was pregnant. The words settled heavily into the room. Robert felt his breath catch. Not because the revelation was shocking, because suddenly everything made sense. The appointments, the housing conversations, the crying phone calls, the fear, the need for support, the exhaustion, all of it. Olivia continued quietly. She was terrified. Another tear escaped. She felt completely alone. Robert looked down briefly. The image of the young woman in the cafe returned immediately. The nervous hands, the worried expression, the constant fear. Now he understood what he had been seeing. Olivia wiped her eyes, then finally addressed the question that had haunted Robert for weeks. The pregnancy test wasn't mine. The room fell silent. For a moment, Robert simply stared at her, not because he hadn't heard correctly, because his mind was replaying every assumption he had made, every sleepless night, every theory, every fear, all built around a conclusion that was completely wrong. Olivia's voice softened. It belonged to her. And just like that, the mystery that had consumed Robert for weeks finally revealed its truth. The positive pregnancy test he found in the trash had never belonged to Olivia at all. For several seconds after Olivia finished speaking, Robert couldn't find words. Not because he was shocked anymore, because he was trying to process how completely wrong he had been. The living room remained quiet. The same room that had witnessed weeks of tension, weeks of distance, weeks of assumptions. Yet now, everything looked different. Not physically, emotionally. The truth had changed the shape of the entire story. Robert leaned back against the couch and slowly exhaled. The breath felt like it had been trapped inside him for weeks. The pregnancy test wasn't Olivia's. The secret trips weren't about betrayal. The late-night phone calls weren't about another relationship. The young woman in Sacramento wasn't a threat to what he and Olivia had built. She was family. A family member Olivia never knew existed. A family member who desperately needed help. Robert lowered his eyes. A mixture of emotions moved through him. Relief arrived first. Powerful relief. The kind that leaves a person feeling physically lighter. For weeks, he had been carrying fears he never wanted to admit out loud. Fears that had followed him to work, followed him into bed, followed him into every conversation. Now those fears were gone. Not because every problem had disappeared, because the worst possibilities no longer existed. Olivia wasn't hiding a second life. She wasn't planning to leave. She wasn't betraying him. The relationship he valued so deeply had never been under attack in the way he imagined. That realization alone felt overwhelming. But relief wasn't the only emotion present. Regret followed immediately behind it. Robert looked toward the coffee table. His mind replayed the previous weeks. The assumptions, the theories, the conclusions he reached without facts. None of them felt good now, especially knowing how much Olivia had already been carrying. While he was trying to understand her behavior, she had been helping a frightened young woman navigate an incredibly difficult situation. While he was creating explanations, Olivia was trying to support family. Family she had only recently discovered. The thought stung. Not because Robert was a bad person, because he cared. And caring people sometimes judge themselves harshly when they realize they were wrong. Olivia sat quietly beside him. She looked emotionally drained. The exhaustion Robert had noticed for weeks suddenly made perfect sense. Finding a half-sister, building that relationship, helping her through a pregnancy, trying to provide support, keeping everything hidden. The burden had been enormous. Robert finally looked at her. "When were you going to tell me?" The question wasn't angry, just honest. Olivia understood immediately. A sad smile touched her face. "I wish I knew." Robert listened. "I kept thinking I would." She rubbed her hands together. "Every time I planned to tell you, something else happened." Her eyes dropped. Then it felt bigger. Another pause. Then it felt harder. Robert nodded slowly. He understood that feeling. Difficult conversations often grow more difficult the longer they wait. One uncomfortable discussion becomes two, then three. Then eventually people feel trapped by their own silence. Olivia released a long breath. "I wasn't trying to keep you out." The statement came quickly, as though it mattered deeply that he understood that. "I know." The answer surprised her. She looked up. Robert continued, "I believe you." For the first time that evening, something shifted in Olivia's expression. The tension around her eyes softened. Not completely, but noticeably. The simple statement seemed to reach her in a way explanations couldn't, because trust isn't rebuilt through speeches. It's rebuilt through moments. Small moments. Honest moments. Moments like this one. Tears filled Olivia's eyes again. This time, they carried a different emotion. Relief. "You do?" Robert nodded. "Yeah." The answer came easily now. Not because the previous weeks hadn't happened. Because he finally understood what caused them. The silence that followed felt different from all the others. Not painful. Not uncomfortable. Peaceful. For the first time in weeks, neither was hiding behind assumptions. Both were finally standing in the same truth. Eventually, Robert smiled faintly. "I spent weeks convincing myself I understood what was happening." Olivia laughed unexpectedly. A genuine laugh. The first one he had heard in a long time. "Oh, no." "Oh, yes." Robert shook his head. "You should have heard some of the theories I came up with." Olivia covered her face. "I don't even want to know." "You really don't?" Another laugh escaped her. The sound immediately changed the atmosphere. Not because everything was fixed, because healing had finally begun. The conversation continued long into the evening. For the first time in weeks, they talked openly about fears, about mistakes, about assumptions, about communication. Neither pretended to be perfect. Neither tried to win. The goal wasn't victory. The goal was understanding. By the time the conversation ended, something important had changed. The distance that had grown between them was finally shrinking. Not all at once. One honest conversation at a time. And as Robert sat beside Olivia, listening instead of assuming, understanding instead of guessing, he made a decision. He could continue focusing on the fears that had consumed him for weeks, or he could focus on the woman sitting beside him, the woman he loved, the woman who needed support now more than ever. The choice wasn't difficult. For the first time since finding the pregnancy test, Robert stopped concentrating on his assumptions and chose to stand beside Olivia instead. The morning after their conversation felt different, not because every problem had disappeared, because the uncertainty had. For weeks, Robert and Olivia had been standing on opposite sides of a misunderstanding. Now, they were finally facing the same direction, and the moment that happened, solutions became easier to find. A few days later, Olivia sat at the kitchen table reviewing paperwork. Documents covered nearly every available surface. Notes, phone numbers, applications, appointment reminders. Robert walked into the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside her. Olivia looked up. A grateful smile appeared immediately. "Thank you. You've been staring at paperwork for an hour. It feels longer. It looks longer." That earned a quiet laugh. The sound pleased Robert more than he expected. Over the previous month, laughter had become rare. Now it was beginning to return. One small moment at a time. Robert pulled out a chair and sat beside her. For several minutes, he simply observed the mountain of documents. Eventually, he shook his head. "You've been handling all of this yourself?" Olivia looked down. The answer was obvious. Mostly. Robert leaned back. The realization hit him again. While he had been trying to solve a mystery, Olivia had been trying to help another person rebuild her life. Neither task was easy. Only one of them truly mattered. He pointed toward the paperwork. "What needs to happen first?" Olivia blinked. What? What needs to happen first? The question surprised her. Robert could tell. For several seconds she simply stared at him. Then something softened in her expression, a mixture of relief and gratitude, the kind that appears when someone realizes they no longer have to carry everything alone. Over the following weeks, Robert became involved, not because anyone asked him to, because he wanted to be. The more he learned about Olivia's half-sister, the more he understood why Olivia had become so emotionally invested. Life had not been easy for her. Stability had been rare, reliable support even rarer. Now she was facing pregnancy while trying to create a future that felt secure. The challenge would have overwhelmed almost anyone. Together, Robert and Olivia began helping where they could. The first major obstacle involved housing. Finding something affordable wasn't easy. Finding something safe proved even harder. Several evenings disappeared into apartment listings, phone calls, research, visits, applications. At one point, Robert found himself staring at rental prices with complete disbelief. He rubbed his forehead. This can't be real. Olivia laughed. I said the same thing. They expect people to afford this? Apparently they did. The search became frustrating, then exhausting, then frustrating again. Yet neither gave up, because for the first time, they were working as a team again. One evening, they sat side by side, reviewing options. Robert pointed toward one listing. What about this one? Olivia studied the screen. A few moments later she nodded. Maybe. The simple exchange meant more than either realized. Weeks earlier, conversations had ended with avoidance. Now they ended with cooperation. The difference was enormous. Eventually progress arrived. Not perfect progress, but real Progress. Each small victory built momentum. A returned phone call. A completed application. A promising lead. One step forward became another, then another. The process took time, but slowly. Stability began replacing uncertainty. Medical appointments became another important focus. Those appointments had been one of the reasons Olivia spent so much time traveling. One of the reasons she had looked so exhausted. Now Robert finally understood. The situation involved more than transportation, more than scheduling. Sometimes support simply meant showing up, being present, listening, helping another person feel less alone. Olivia had been doing that for months. Now Robert helped whenever possible. One evening, after returning home from an appointment, Olivia collapsed onto the couch. Not dramatically, just tired. The kind of tired that follows weeks of emotional responsibility. Robert sat beside her. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Olivia smiled. "You know what? I forgot what this felt like." "What?" "Having help." The honesty caught him off guard. Robert looked toward her. Olivia stared at the ceiling. A thoughtful expression crossed her face. "I got so used to carrying everything myself." The statement stayed with him, because it explained more than she realized. Not just the previous months, the silence, the secrecy, the pressure, all of it. She had been trying to solve an impossible situation alone. Robert reached over and squeezed her hand. "You don't have to anymore." Olivia looked at him. A genuine smile appeared. This time the smile reached her eyes. As the weeks passed, another change began happening. Something neither expected. Family started forming. Not through biology, through relationships. The connection between Olivia and her half-sister grew stronger with each conversation, with each shared experience, with each story exchanged. Years of separation couldn't be erased overnight, but understanding began filling the empty space. Questions received answers. Memories were shared. Common traits became impossible to ignore. Sometimes Olivia would laugh at something and immediately realize her half-sister laughed the same way. Other times, a habit would appear, a phrase, a gesture, a reaction. Small reminders that connection existed long before either of them knew it. Those discoveries meant everything to Olivia. Robert noticed the difference immediately. The stress that had dominated her life for months gradually began easing, not disappearing. Easing. The constant tension in her shoulders faded. The exhausted look behind her eyes softened. The forced smiles disappeared. Real smiles returned. One afternoon, Robert walked into the kitchen and found Olivia dancing while cooking. Not professionally, not gracefully, just happily. He leaned against the doorway, watching, amused. Olivia eventually noticed him. "Oh no." "What?" "You've been standing there for a while." She laughed. "You weren't supposed to see that." It was magnificent. It was not. It absolutely was. The playful exchange continued. Simple, ordinary. Yet Robert appreciated every second, because for a long time, joy had been missing from their home. Now it was finding its way back. One evening they sat together on the patio as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. The air felt calm, comfortable. Neither seemed eager to go inside. For a while, they simply enjoyed the quiet. Then, Olivia spoke. "I think things are finally getting better." Robert looked toward her. She wasn't talking about one specific problem. She was talking about all of it. The fear, the secrecy, the pressure, the uncertainty, everything. Robert smiled. "I think you're right." Olivia leaned against his shoulder. A simple gesture, one she had done countless times before. Yet this time it felt meaningful, because they had fought their way back to this moment. Not through perfection, through honesty, through patience, through choosing each other when misunderstanding could have driven them apart. As darkness settled around them, Robert realized something important. The situation that nearly damaged their relationship had unexpectedly done something else. It had expanded their family. And for the first time since this entire journey began, that family finally felt complete enough to start moving forward together. The family was beginning to feel whole. A few months later, Robert stood in a backyard holding a paper plate overloaded with food. Again, some things, apparently, never changed. Music drifted through the warm California afternoon. Children raced across the grass. Laughter erupted from different corners of the yard. Somebody was debating sports near the grill. Somebody else was arguing about the proper way to season barbecue. Several conversations happened at once. Nobody seemed bothered by it. In fact, the chaos felt familiar now. Comfortable. Robert looked around and smiled. The first time he attended one of Olivia's family cookouts, he had felt completely overwhelmed. Back then, he spent most of the afternoon trying to understand how so many people could talk simultaneously without anyone losing track of the conversation. Now he barely noticed. The noise had become part of the experience, part of the charm, part of the family. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You're still too skinny." Robert laughed immediately. There it was. The same observation, the same determination, the same ongoing battle he had never managed to win. He looked down at his plate, then back up. "I've been eating all day." The response achieved absolutely nothing. A few nearby relatives agreed that he needed more food. Others joined the discussion. Within moments, Robert found himself defending his plate like a lawyer presenting evidence. Olivia spotted the exchange from across the yard. Her laughter carried through the crowd. The sound immediately made Robert smile. Not because the situation was particularly funny, because hearing her laugh like that felt good, natural, easy, the way it used to, the way it should. A few minutes later, Olivia joined him. "You losing the argument?" "I never had a chance." "You really didn't." Robert shook his head. "Thanks for the support." "I support the family." "That's cold." "It is what it is." Both laughed. The playful exchange reminded Robert how far they had come. Not just as a couple, as people. A few months earlier, they had been sitting in a living room separated by fear and misunderstanding. Now they were standing side by side again, comfortable, connected, stronger. The difference mattered, more than either of them could fully express. The afternoon continued. Music played. Food disappeared. Stories were shared. Several people challenged each other to dominoes. Unfortunately, Robert once again became involved. Unfortunately, Robert once again lost. Repeatedly. Spectacularly. One relative celebrated every victory as though a championship had just been won. Another offered advice that somehow made Robert's performance worse. Olivia enjoyed every second of it. At one point, she laughed so hard she nearly spilled her drink. Robert pointed toward her. "You are not helping." "I know. You're supposed to be on my side?" "No one can help you here." The surrounding group immediately agreed. Robert accepted his fate. There are some battles a person simply cannot win. Eventually, the game ended. Thankfully, Robert escaped with what little dignity remained. The celebration around him continued. As the afternoon slowly shifted toward evening, the atmosphere became even more relaxed. People settled into lawn chairs. Conversations deepened. The music lowered slightly. The pace softened. Robert found himself standing near the edge of the yard watching everything unfold. A cool breeze moved through the trees. The scent of barbecue still lingered in the air. Nearby, Olivia was talking and laughing with family. The sight held his attention, not because anything extraordinary was happening, because ordinary moments looked different now. He appreciated them more. A few months ago, he nearly allowed fear to define his understanding of reality. He nearly allowed assumptions to speak louder than communication. He nearly damaged something precious because he lacked information. The realization stayed with him, not as a source of guilt, as a lesson, a powerful lesson, one worth remembering. Olivia eventually walked over and stood beside him. For several seconds, neither spoke. The comfortable silence returned. One of their favorite things, the kind of silence built through trust rather than distance. Olivia gently bumped his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" Robert smiled. "A lot." "That sounds dangerous." "I've heard that before." Olivia laughed. The memory immediately brought both of them back to one of their earliest conversations. A conversation from a completely different chapter of life. A conversation that now felt surprisingly close, despite everything that happened since. Robert looked around the yard, then back toward Olivia. You know what's funny? What? If somebody had told me months ago that all of this started because of a pregnancy test in a trash can, I would have believed that was the important part. Olivia smiled knowingly. But it wasn't. No, it wasn't. Not even close. The pregnancy test had only been the beginning. The object itself wasn't the lesson. The lesson was everything that followed. The assumptions, the silence, the fear, the conversations that never happened, the courage required to finally have them. For a while they simply stood there together, watching family interact, watching connections form, watching people support one another. Robert realized something important. Family isn't always defined by simplicity. Sometimes family arrives unexpectedly. Sometimes it grows through difficult circumstances. Sometimes it asks people to expand their hearts in ways they never anticipated. That truth surrounded him now. Everywhere he looked. The cookout continued around them. Laughter echoed across the yard. Music filled the air. People shared stories. People shared food. People shared life. And somehow, all of it connected to the lesson Robert would carry forward. Communication matters. Not because it prevents every problem. Because it prevents imagination from filling empty spaces with fear. Trust matters. Not because people never make mistakes. Because trust creates room for honesty when mistakes happen. Family matters. Not because families are perfect. Because they provide support when life becomes complicated. Robert glanced toward Olivia. She looked happier than she had in months. The exhaustion that once followed her everywhere had faded. Peace had returned. Not magically, not instantly, gradually, the way healing often does. Before we finish this story, I want to hear from you. Have you ever assumed the worst about a situation, only to discover the truth was completely different? Have you ever learned a life lesson through misunderstanding, communication, or trust? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched you in any way, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Mr. George Stories. Your support helps these stories reach more people, and it allows us to keep sharing meaningful lessons through powerful storytelling. As the evening sun settled lower in the sky, Robert found himself reflecting one final time. Not on the mystery, not on the fear, not on the sleepless nights, on the lesson. Because the pregnancy test was never the real story. The real story was what happened afterward. The real story was how quickly fear can create conclusions when communication disappears. The real story was how assumptions can quietly build walls between people who love each other. The real story was how trust requires honesty, how honesty requires courage, and how courage often begins with a difficult conversation. Most importantly, the real story was about love. The kind of love that listens. The kind of love that stays. The kind of love that chooses understanding before judgment. Standing there beside Olivia, surrounded by laughter, music, food, and family, Robert finally understood what this entire experience had been teaching him. Fear can divide people. Assumptions can divide people. Silence can divide people. But trust, communication, and love have the power to bring people back together. And in the end, that was the story worth remembering. The pregnancy test was never the real story. The real story was learning how fear, assumptions, trust, and love can either divide a family or bring one together.